Sarah Martinez stepped off the bus at Camp Pendleton with her duffel bag slung over her shoulder and determination burning in her chest. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing barely 120 pounds, she looked more like a college student than a future Marine. The other recruits towered over her, their broad shoulders and muscled frames making her feel like a child who had wandered into the wrong place. The drill instructor's voice boomed across the training ground like thunder. Staff Sergeant Williams was a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could wake the dead. His eyes swept over the new recruits, pausing for a moment when they landed on Sarah. She saw something flicker across his face, doubt, maybe even pity. "Listen up, maggots," Williams shouted. "For the next 13 weeks, this place will be your hell, your heaven, and everything in between. Some of you think you're tough. Some of you think you've got what it takes. But I'm here to tell you that thinking and doing are two very different things." Sarah stood at attention with the others, her back straight and her eyes fixed straight ahead. Around her, she could hear the heavy breathing of nervous recruits. Some shifted from foot to foot. Others cleared their throats softly. But Sarah remained perfectly still, even as sweat began to bead on her forehead under the California sun. The first week was brutal. Every morning started at 500 hours with physical training that pushed everyone to their limits. Push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, and long runs that seemed to stretch forever across the base. Sarah struggled with the pull-ups from the beginning. While the bigger recruits could muscle their way up the bar, she had to fight for every inch. "Martinez!" Williams would bark when he saw her shaking arms, barely getting her chin over the bar. "Is that all you've got? My grandmother could do better than that, and she's been dead for 10 years. The other recruits began to notice her struggles. During chow time, she could hear their whispered conversations at nearby tables. They talked about how she was holding back the platoon, how she didn't belong there, how she was going to wash out before the end of the month. "She's too small," muttered Jackson, a hulking recruit from Texas who looked like he could bench press a car. "No way she makes it through the crucible. Hell, I'm surprised she made it through the first week. Feel sorry for whoever gets stuck carrying her gear when she breaks down," added Thompson, another large recruit who seemed to enjoy making others feel small. Sarah heard every word, but she kept eating her meal in silence. She had learned long ago that responding to bullies only made things worse. Instead, she focused on the food in front of her, knowing she needed every calorie to fuel her training the next day. That night, after lights out, Sarah lay in her narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling. Around her, the barracks filled with the sounds of sleeping recruits, snoring, turning, the occasional mumbled word from someone lost in a dream. But sleep wouldn't come for her. The doubt that had been growing in her mind all week was now a constant companion. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was too weak, too small, too different to make it as a Marine. She thought about her father, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and came home with stories of brotherhood and honor. She thought about her older brother, who had tried to talk her out of enlisting because he thought it would be too hard for her. But then she remembered why she was here. It wasn't to prove anything to Jackson or Thompson, or even Staff Sergeant Williams. It was to prove something to herself. She had spent her whole life being underestimated because of her size. Teachers who thought she couldn't handle advanced classes. Coaches who put her on the bench because they assumed she wasn't strong enough. Even friends who treated her like she needed protection from the world. The next morning brought a new challenge: hand-to-hand combat training. The recruits paired off for basic grappling exercises, and Sarah found herself matched against Rodriguez, a wiry recruit from New Mexico who had at least 30 pounds on her. "Try not to hurt the little lady," Jackson called out from across the mat, earning laughter from several other recruits. Rodriguez grinned and shook his head. "Don't worry, I'll go easy on you," he whispered to Sarah as they faced each other. But Sarah didn't want anyone to go easy on her. She had been studying the techniques they learned, practicing the moves in her head over and over again. When the instructor gave the signal to begin, Rodriguez came at her with obvious restraint, telegraphing his moves like he was wrestling with a child. Sarah waited for her moment. When Rodriguez reached for her with lazy confidence, she grabbed his wrist, pivoted, and used his own momentum to send him tumbling across the mat. He landed hard on his back, The wind knocked out of him, staring up at the ceiling in shock. The laughter from the other recruits died instantly. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had been watching from the sidelines, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "Lucky shot," Rodriguez muttered as he got back to his feet, but Sarah could see the uncertainty in his eyes now. They went again, and this time Rodriguez was more careful, more respectful of his opponent. But Sarah had tasted success, and it fed the fire that had been burning inside her since she arrived. She moved like water, flowing around his attacks, using his size against him. When the exercise ended, Rodriguez was breathing hard and nursing, a bruised ego along with several actual bruises. That evening, the whispers in the chow hall had a different tone. Some recruits looked at her with curiosity instead of dismissal. Others seemed nervous, like they were seeing her clearly for the first time. But Jackson and his group of followers weren't impressed. If anything, they seemed more determined to prove that Sarah didn't belong. They began finding small ways to make her life harder, taking her spot in line, accidentally bumping into her during formations, making jokes just loud enough for her to hear but not loud enough for the drill instructors to notice. Sarah endured it all in silence. But inside, something was changing. Every insult, every doubt, every condescending look was fuel for a fire that was growing stronger each day. She began staying after training to practice moves on her own, studying technique videos in the base library, and pushing herself harder than anyone else in the platoon. She was tired of being underestimated. She was tired of being seen as weak. Most of all, she was tired of holding back. The 4th week of training brought advanced combat techniques, and Sarah threw herself into every lesson with fierce intensity. While other recruits complained about the complexity of the moves or joked around during practice, she absorbed every detail like her life depended on it. Because in her mind it did. Combat instructor Sergeant Davis was a compact man with scarred knuckles and eyes that missed nothing. He had served 3 deployments and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had been tested in real combat. Unlike Williams, who relied on volume and intimidation, Davis taught through demonstration and precise correction. "Combat isn't about being the biggest or the strongest," he told the class one sweltering afternoon. "It's about being the smartest and the fastest. It's about reading your opponent and finding their weakness before they find yours." Sarah hung on every word. She watched as Davis demonstrated pressure points, joint locks, and leverage techniques that could disable opponents twice your size. She practiced the moves until her muscles ached, repeating them over and over until they became second nature. The other recruits began to notice her dedication, but their reactions were mixed. Some, like Chen and Williams, a different Williams, from the drill instructor, started asking her for help with techniques they were struggling with. But Jackson's group saw her improvement as a threat to their position in the platoon's informal hierarchy. During a water break, Thompson cornered her near the equipment shed. "Think you're hot stuff now, don't you, Martinez?" he said, stepping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "One lucky throw doesn't make you a warrior." "I'm not trying to be anything except a Marine," Sarah replied, quietly, not backing down but not escalating either. "Marines look out for each other," Thompson continued. "But you're just looking out for yourself, trying to show off, make the rest of us look bad." Jackson appeared beside Thompson, along with 2 other recruits named Foster and Brooks. All 4 of them were significantly larger than Sarah, and they had positioned themselves to block her path back to the training area. "Maybe it's time someone taught you about teamwork," Jackson said with a cold smile. "About knowing your place." Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but not from fear. It was the same feeling she got before a particularly difficult training exercise, a mixture of adrenaline and anticipation. She glanced around and noticed that Sergeant Davis was helping another recruit with a technique near the far end of the training ground. Staff Sergeant Williams was nowhere to be seen. "There's no problem here," she said calmly. "I just want to get back to training." "Oh, there's definitely a problem," Foster chimed in. He was the largest of the group, with arms like telephone poles and a neck that seemed to connect directly to his shoulders. "The problem is you thinking you belong here." Brooks, who rarely spoke but always seemed to be simmering with barely controlled anger, took a step closer. My dad's a Marine. My grandfather was a Marine. I've been preparing for this my whole life. But you just walk in here and think you can play soldier. Sarah could feel the situation escalating beyond words. Part of her wanted to walk away, to report the incident to the instructors, to handle it through proper channels. But a larger part of her was tired of running, tired of backing down, tired of being treated like she didn't deserve to be there. "I'm not playing anything," she said, her voice still calm but with an edge of steel that hadn't been there before. "I earned my place here same as you. Prove it," Jackson said. And before anyone could react, he shoved her hard in the chest. Sarah stumbled backward but kept her feet. The shove wasn't hard enough to knock her down, but it was clearly meant to humiliate her, to make her back down, or cry for help. Instead, she straightened up and looked Jackson directly in the eyes. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked. Jackson laughed and looked around at his friends. "Listen to her. She thinks she can take on 4 Marines." "I don't think anything," Sarah replied. "But if you want to find out, that's up to you." The challenge hung in the air between them. Sarah could see the calculations running through Jackson's mind. He had 40 pounds on her easily, plus 3 friends for backup. In his world, this was an easy win that would put the small recruit back in her place and reinforce his position as one of the alpha males in the platoon. Thompson cracked his knuckles loudly. This is going to be fun. But as they began to circle her, Sarah felt something she had never experienced before. It wasn't fear or anger or even determination. It was a cold, calculating calm that seemed to slow down time and sharpen her focus to a razor's edge. She could see every tell in their body language, every telegraph of their intentions, every opening in their positioning. They came at her together, confident in their numerical advantage. Jackson reached for her first, trying to grab her in a bear hug that would have ended the fight before it really began. But Sarah wasn't where he expected her to be. She had slipped to the side at the last second, grabbed his extended arm, and used his own momentum to send him crashing into Thompson. Foster, seeing his 2 friends tangled up, charged at Sarah with his head down like a bull. She waited until the last possible second, then stepped aside and helped him along his path with a perfectly placed push that sent him tumbling into a pile of training equipment. Brooks was more cautious, having seen what happened to his friends. He approached her with his hands up in a boxing stance, throwing quick jabs that she easily avoided. Sarah could see the frustration building in his face as his punches hit nothing but air. She waited for him to overcommit, then grabbed his wrist and executed a perfect arm drag that sent him face first into the dirt. By now, Jackson and Thompson had untangled themselves and were back on their feet. But their confidence was gone. Jackson's face was red with embarrassment and anger, while Thompson looked genuinely confused about what had just happened. "You got lucky," Jackson snarled, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "3 times?" Sarah asked, still in that strange, calm state where everything seemed crystal clear. Foster had climbed out of the equipment pile and was nursing a scraped elbow. Brooks was spitting dirt out of his mouth and glaring at her like she had somehow cheated. All 4 of them looked at her with a mixture of shock and something that might have been respect. "This isn't over," Thompson said, but he was already backing away. "Yes, it is," said a voice from behind them. Everyone turned to see Sergeant Davis approaching, his face unreadable. He had clearly seen at least part of what had happened, but it was impossible to tell what he was thinking. "Martinez," he said, back to training. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, falling into step behind him. As they walked away from the 4 recruits, Davis spoke quietly without looking at her. "That was some impressive technique back there." "Thank you, sir." "Where did you learn to move like that?" Sarah hesitated. The truth was complicated, and she wasn't sure how much she wanted to reveal. "My father taught me some things, sir. And I've been studying the techniques you showed us." Davis nodded slowly. "Your father military?" "Army, sir. 2 tours in Afghanistan. And he taught you hand-to-hand combat." "He taught me that being small doesn't mean being helpless, sir." Davis stopped walking and turned to look at her for the first time since the incident. "Those 4 recruits outweighed you by what, 40 pounds each?" "At least, sir." "And you took them all down without breaking a sweat." Sarah realized he was right. Despite what had just happened, her breathing was steady, her heart rate was normal, and she didn't feel tired at all. If anything, she felt energized. "Guess I did, sir." Davis stared at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Word of advice, Martinez. That kind of skill tends to get noticed around here. Make sure you're ready for the attention that's coming your way." Word spread through the platoon like wildfire. By evening chow, every recruit knew that the small girl from California had taken down 4 of the biggest guys in their group without even breathing hard. The story grew in the telling. Some versions had her throwing all 4 at once. Others claimed she had knocked them unconscious. Sarah sat at her usual table with Chen and a few other recruits who had always treated her decently. But now she could feel eyes on her from every corner of the mess hall. Some looks were admiring, others were calculating, and a few were downright hostile. "Is it true you threw Jackson over your shoulder?" asked Patel, a quiet recruit from Ohio who rarely spoke above a whisper. "Nothing that dramatic," Sarah replied, focusing on her mashed potatoes. "Just some basic techniques Sergeant Davis taught us." But Chen, who had heard the story from 3 different sources, shook his head. "Rodriguez says you moved like you were dancing. Said he'd never seen anything like it." Sarah looked up to find Rodriguez nodding enthusiastically from 2 tables over. He caught her eye and gave her a respectful nod, a far cry from the condescending grin he had worn during their first sparring session. The next few days brought a strange new dynamic to the platoon. Jackson and his friends avoided Sarah completely, though she could feel their resentment simmering beneath the surface. Other recruits began seeking her out for advice on combat techniques, treating her with a respect she had never experienced before. But the most significant change came from Staff Sergeant Williams himself. During morning PT, he began paying closer attention to Sarah's performance. Not the hostile scrutiny she had endured in the early weeks, but the focused observation of someone evaluating potential. "Martinez," he called out during combat drills, on Friday morning. Front and center, Sarah jogged to the front of the formation, her stomach knotting with anxiety. Williams had a reputation for singling out recruits when he wanted to make an example of them, and it rarely ended well for the recruit in question. "Demonstrate the shoulder throw we learned yesterday," Williams ordered. "Yes, sir. Do you want me to use Rodriguez again?" Williams shook his head and pointed to Jackson, who was standing near the back of the formation looking like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. "Jackson, get up here." The entire platoon went silent. Everyone knew about the incident behind the equipment shed, though the official story was that it had been a training accident that resulted in 4 recruits having to clean latrines for a week. Now Williams was essentially ordering a rematch, in front of everyone. Jackson approached reluctantly, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. At 6'2" and 190 pounds, he still had significant advantages in size and strength over Sarah. But everyone present had heard what happened the last time he underestimated her. "Standard shoulder throw," Williams announced to the platoon. "Martinez will demonstrate proper technique." Sarah and Jackson faced each other on the practice mat. She could see the conflict in his eyes. Part of him wanted revenge for the humiliation he had suffered, but part of him was genuinely afraid of being embarrassed again in front of the entire platoon. "Don't hold back," Williams instructed. "I want to see full effort from both of you." Jackson nodded grimly and dropped into a fighting stance. This time there was no lazy confidence, no assumption that his size would carry the day. He had learned to respect his opponent even if he didn't like her. They circled each other warily for several seconds. Jackson feinted left, then right, testing Sarah's reactions. She remained centered and calm, watching his footwork and waiting for her opening. When Jackson finally committed to his attack, it was with the full force of his considerable strength. He lunged forward, trying to tackle Sarah around the waist and use his weight advantage to drive her to the ground. But Sarah had been expecting exactly this approach. She pivoted at the last second, grabbed Jackson's extended arm, and executed a perfect shoulder throw that sent him flying through the air. He landed hard on his back with a sound that made several recruits wince. The platoon erupted in cheers and applause. Even Jackson's friends looked impressed, though they tried to hide it. Jackson himself lay on the mat for a moment, staring up at the sky with a look of resigned acceptance. "Outstanding," Williams barked, and for the first time since Sarah had arrived at boot camp, he sounded genuinely pleased with her performance. That, recruits, is what proper technique looks like. Size and strength mean nothing if you don't know how to use them. He turned to address the entire platoon, using his drill instructor voice to make sure everyone could hear him clearly. Some of you came here thinking that being big and strong was all you needed to be a Marine. Others came here worried that being small meant you couldn't cut it. Both groups were wrong. Being a Marine is about discipline, technique, and the will to never quit. Martinez just demonstrated all three. Sarah felt a surge of pride unlike anything she had ever experienced. After weeks of being dismissed, doubted, and underestimated, she was finally being recognized for what she could actually do, rather than judged for what she looked like. But her satisfaction was short-lived. That afternoon, during weapons training, she overheard a conversation that made her realize her troubles were far from over. She was field stripping her M16 when she heard familiar voices from the next station over. Foster and Brooks were talking in low tones, but the concrete walls of the weapons shed carried their words clearly. "It's not natural," Foster was saying. "Girls that small don't fight like that. There's something weird about her." "My money says she's on something," Brooks replied. "Steroids or whatever. No way she takes down Jackson clean without chemical help." "Should we report it?" Foster asked. "To who? Williams? He's practically in love with her now. Did you see how he was looking at her during the demonstration?" Sarah's hand stilled on her rifle. She had worked so hard to prove herself through legitimate means, and now they were trying to undermine her achievements by suggesting she was cheating. "There's got to be something," Brooks continued. "Maybe she had training before she came here. Professional training. That would explain why she knows moves we haven't even learned yet. So what do? We watch her. Document everything. Sooner or later she'll slip up and we'll be there to catch her." Sarah finished cleaning her weapon in silence, her mind racing. She had hoped that proving herself would end the harassment, but it seemed to have only changed the nature of it. Now, instead of being dismissed as too weak, she was being viewed with suspicion for being too skilled. That evening, she lay in her bunk thinking about her father's words from years earlier. She had been 12 years old and crying because some boys at school had been teasing her about her size. "Mija," he had said, sitting on the edge of her bed, "there will always be people who try to make you small. When you're actually small, they'll say you're too weak. When you prove you're not weak, they'll say you're cheating. When you prove you're not cheating, they'll find something else. The only opinion that matters is your own." She had asked him how she could stop caring, what other people thought. "You don't stop caring," he had replied. "You just care more about proving yourself to yourself than proving yourself to them. And sometimes, Mija, the best way to do that is to show them exactly what you're capable of." Now, lying in the dark barracks, listening to the sounds of sleeping, recruits, Sarah made a decision. She was tired of defending herself, tired of having to prove her worth over and over again. If Foster and Brooks wanted to document her abilities, she would give them something worth documenting. The next week would bring the combat fitness test, one of the most challenging evaluations in boot camp. It was designed to push recruits to their absolute limits and separate those who had what it took from those who didn't. Sarah decided it was time to stop holding back. The combat fitness test arrived with the kind of scorching heat that made the California desert feel like an oven. Sarah woke before réveillé, her body tense with anticipation. Today would be different from all the other tests and evaluations. Today, she would show everyone exactly what she was capable of. The test consisted of 3 parts: an 880-yard run in combat gear, ammunition can lifts, and a 300-yard shuttle run carrying different weights. Most recruits approached it as a necessary evil to endure. Sarah approached it as an opportunity to make a statement. Staff Sergeant Williams gathered the platoon at 600 hours, his usual scowl even deeper than normal in the pre-dawn darkness. "Today you find out if you've got what it takes to be a United States Marine," he announced. The combat fitness test isn't just about physical ability. It's about mental toughness, determination, and the will to push through when everything in your body is telling you to quit. He let his eyes sweep across the assembled recruits, pausing briefly when they landed on Sarah. Some of you will exceed expectations today. Others will fall short. But all of you will give everything you have. Or you'll find yourself starting over with the next platoon. The first event was the 880-yard run in full combat gear. Sarah lined up with the others at the starting line, her equipment properly secured and her game face on. Around her, she could hear the nervous breathing and quiet trash talk of her fellow recruits. Jackson was positioned 2 lanes over, having apparently drawn the conclusion that ignoring her was better than confronting her again. Foster and Brooks flanked him on either side, both shooting occasional glances in Sarah's direction. When the starting signal sounded, the platoon took off like a pack of wolves. The bigger recruits immediately pushed to the front, their longer strides eating up ground quickly. Sarah settled into a steady pace, keeping herself in the middle of the pack for the first quarter mile. But as they rounded the first turn, she began to move. Not the desperate sprint of someone trying to catch up, but the smooth acceleration of a runner who had been holding back. She passed one recruit, then another, then 3 more in quick succession. By the halfway point, she was in the top 10. By the 3-quarter mark, she was in 5th place and still accelerating. The recruits around her were beginning to show signs of fatigue. Labored breathing, shortened strides, the beginnings of the dead-eyed stare that came with oxygen debt. Sarah felt none of it. If anything, she felt like she was just getting warmed up. With 200 yards to go, she made her move. She shifted into a higher gear that nobody knew she possessed, her stride lengthening and her pace increasing dramatically. She passed the 4th-place runner like he was standing still, then the 3rd, then the 2nd. The recruit in 1st place was Morrison, a former high school track star from Florida, who had been setting the pace for distance runs since the first week of boot camp. He was 20 yards ahead with 50 yards to go, and he looked back to see Sarah bearing down on him like a guided missile. Morrison tried to respond, digging deep for a final kick that had won him races in high school. But Sarah wasn't just running fast, she was running effortlessly, as if the weight of her combat gear and the heat of the desert sun meant nothing to her. She caught Morrison with 10 yards to go and crossed the finish line a full stride ahead of him. Her time was not just a personal best. It was the fastest time any recruit in the platoon had ever recorded, male or female. The entire platoon, including the drill instructors, stared in stunned silence as Sarah came to a stop and began her cool-down routine. She wasn't gasping for air or doubled over in exhaustion. She looked like she had just finished a light jog around the block. Morrison, meanwhile, was on his hands and knees trying not to throw up. What the hell was that? Foster whispered to Brooks, loud enough for several people to hear. Staff Sergeant. Williams approached Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. Martinez, he said, checking his stopwatch. Did you run track in high school? No, sir, Sarah replied honestly. College? No, sir. I wasn't in college. Williams frowned and looked at his stopwatch again, as if the numbers might have changed. Have you ever run a time like this before? Sarah paused, thinking about the question carefully. The truth was that she had never been timed in anything like formal conditions. Her father had trained her to run, but they had never cared about specific times or distances. I don't know, sir. I've never been timed in an official race before. Williams nodded slowly, then turned to address the rest of the platoon. Outstanding performance, Martinez. That's the kind of effort I want to see from all of you. But Sarah could see the questions in his eyes, the same suspicious curiosity that had been growing in Foster and Brooks. A performance like this didn't come from nowhere, and everyone knew it. The second event was ammunition can lifts, lifting 2 30-pound cans from shoulder height to overhead as many times as possible in 2 minutes. This was typically an event that favored the larger recruits, and Sarah expected to post a respectable but unremarkable score. Instead, something extraordinary happened. As she began the lifts, she felt that same strange calm that had come over her during the fight behind the equipment shed. Time seemed to slow down, and the weight of the cans seemed to diminish until they felt almost weightless in her hands. She fell into a rhythm that was both powerful and efficient, her form perfect, and her breathing controlled. Around her, other recruits were grunting and straining, their faces red with effort. Sarah looked like she was performing a meditation exercise. When the 2 minutes ended, Sarah had completed 67 repetitions. The platoon record was 52. The silence that followed was even more pronounced than after her run. Every person present, recruits and instructors alike, knew they had just witnessed something exceptional. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. Staff Sergeant Williams walked over to Sarah with a look of genuine bewilderment. "Martinez, I need you to be honest with me. What kind of training did you have before you came here?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "My father taught me some things, sir. Basic fitness, some self-defense. Nothing formal. Your father's Army, right?" "Yes, sir." "What unit?" 75th Ranger Regiment, sir." Williams' eyebrows shot up. The 75th Rangers were elite special operations soldiers, among the most highly trained warriors in the U.S. military. If Sarah's father had been a ranger, that would explain a lot about her unusual abilities. "And he trained you personally?" "Yes, sir. From the time I was young." Williams nodded, some of the mystery apparently solved in his mind, but Sarah could see that others weren't satisfied with this explanation. Foster was talking rapidly to Brooks, his hands moving animatedly as he made some point. Jackson was staring at Sarah with an expression of pure disbelief. The final event was the 300-yard shuttle run, which involved sprinting back and forth between two lines while carrying different weights: ammunition cans, dummy grenades, and a simulated casualty drag. By this point, several recruits were beginning to look nervous. They had just watched Sarah dominate two events in ways that defied easy explanation, and they were starting to wonder what she might do for an encore. Sarah lined up for her turn with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of. The shuttle run was actually her favorite of the three events because it combined speed, agility, and technique, all areas where her size was actually an advantage rather than a handicap. When the starting signal came, Sarah exploded forward like she had been shot from a cannon. She flew through the course with a grace and efficiency that made it look like a choreographed dance. Every turn was perfect, every transition smooth, every movement economical and precise. She finished with a time that shattered not just the platoon record, but the company record and possibly the battalion record as well. This time the silence that followed was broken by Staff Sergeant Williams himself. "Sweet Mother of God," he said quietly. Sarah stood at attention, waiting for further instructions, but she could feel the weight of dozens of stares. Some were admiring, others were confused, and a few were openly hostile. Foster stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and suspicion. "I call bullshit," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. The training ground went completely silent. Challenging an official test result was serious business, and doing it publicly was potentially career-ending. But Foster seemed past caring about consequences. "Nobody runs times like that without serious performance enhancement. Nobody lifts like that at her size. This whole thing stinks." Staff Sergeant Williams turned slowly to face Foster, his expression dangerous. "Are you accusing a fellow recruit of cheating, Foster?" Foster's Adam's apple bobbed nervously, but he held his ground. "I'm saying that what we just saw isn't humanly possible for someone her size without help." Williams took a step closer to Foster. "And what kind of help are you suggesting?" "Drugs, sir. Steroids or something stronger. There's no other explanation." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized that her moment of triumph had just become something much more dangerous. The accusation of drug use hit the training ground like a thunderbolt. Every recruit froze in place, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something that could end careers and destroy lives. In the Marine Corps, integrity wasn't just expected. It was sacred. Staff Sergeant Williams's face went through several shades of red before settling on a color that reminded Sarah of dried blood. When he spoke, his voice was low and deadly calm. "Foster, you just made a very serious accusation against a fellow Marine. I hope for your sake that you can back it up with something more than hurt feelings and wounded pride." Foster's confidence wavered slightly, but he pressed on. "Sir, I've been watching her for weeks. The way she moves, the techniques she knows, that we haven't been taught yet, and now these impossible test scores. It doesn't add up." What doesn't add up, Williams replied, is why you think you're qualified to determine what's possible and what isn't. Martinez has explained her background. Her father is a ranger who trained her from childhood. That's